Dr. Tamika Gillum, thank you for joining us here on New Mexico in Focus.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me.
Your research found a staggering disparity in 2020, where Black women were murdered at nearly 4 times the rates as white women. What does this disparity reveal about the broader and structural forces reshaping violence in the United States?
Yeah, well, it definitely speaks to the unique vulnerability of women of color in particular in terms of some of the structural barriers that are faced by communities of color, which facilitate things like high rates of poverty, racial segregation and redlining have placed African Americans in neighborhoods that experience significant rates of crime, rates of poverty, high police presence, struggles in terms of employment, underemployment, unemployment. All of these things, neighborhood disorganization, all of these things create circumstances that essentially make Black women more vulnerable to experiencing violence in multiple forms. Violence from intimate partners, violence from police, all of these things are enhanced. And so essentially you're dealing with a circumstance where women are experiencing, Black women are experiencing these disparities that are literally 4 times as much as what, in some places that disparity is as high as 20 times as much. If you look at states like the state of Wisconsin, Black women experience homicide at a rate 20 times that of white women. And so, that disparity varies significantly, but it's present essentially in any of these states.
Now, you've described the killing of Black women as a public health crisis. From a population health perspective, why is it important to use this lens when examining the 11.6 per 100,000 homicide rates for Black women?
Yeah, it's important because when you think about, this is something that is killing a significant portion of the population. And anytime we have any type of disparity in disease, for example, when it's acknowledged as a disparity, then there tends to be more resources allocated to trying to understand the problem more and try to address the problem, right? And so part of what we need is just for there to be an acknowledgement that this is a public health crisis. There's still some failure to truly acknowledge that. Once we do, we can better put ourselves in a position to better study, better understand, and better put into place resources that are beyond just temporary quick fixes, but hopefully things that get at some of the underlying factors that contribute to the violence that this community is experiencing and the unique vulnerability that Black women subsequently experience.
Now, in your review of the national mortality data, how often are these deaths misclassified, underreported, and are we potentially looking at numbers that are even higher than this 11.6 per 100,000 residents, this homicide?
We are definitely looking at the potential for undercounting in this respect. There's a lot of support for the contention that these deaths aren't necessarily always accurately captured, and that's especially the case with Black trans women. There's often issues in terms of misgendering, sometimes failure to sort of recognize these, especially as hate crimes that they often are. And so the reality is that we see these disparities, but it's very possible that the full magnitude of that is not fully understood in that respect.
Now, you mentioned Wisconsin. Elaborate on that a little bit. Where Black women were killed 20 times more likely than white women. What's going on in Wisconsin?
The Black community in a lot of places, has experienced significant issues, but Wisconsin is a unique case as well in terms of some of the exacerbated conditions of just poverty and high crime and violence that the Black communities experience. Most of that community is concentrated in the Milwaukee area. And that city has unfortunately, experienced a lot of significant economic decline, factors associated with that, and the Black community has been disenfranchised there for a long time. The state itself has been problematic in terms of its treatment of Black communities in that space. I have some community connections in Wisconsin, and I've started doing research there multiple years ago. And at that time, about 20 years ago or so, there was even the fact that the Black population represented less than 10% of the state, but yet over 50% of the prison population, right? So there's some significant issues going on in relation to structural racism that has exacerbated some circumstances for Black communities.
The recent conviction of Sean Grayson in the killing of Sonia Massey has reignited a national conversation about police violence. How does the state-sanctioned violence, particularly police shootings, interest your broader findings of the killing of Black women in the United States?
Yeah, so in the sense of sort of this notion of state-sanctioned violence, I mean, you're talking about police officers going into communities, and Black communities tend to be over-policed, which essentially exposes Black communities to encounters with police more often, where research supports that Black women are more likely to be stopped, more likely to be arrested, more likely to be on the receiving end of the use of force from police officers. And so it's not necessarily surprising then that Black women tend to experience higher rates of violence at the hands of police officers, including homicides, right? And the Sonia Massey case was an excellent prime example of that. And the sentencing was great that, that we got some sense of accountability in that respect, because that has been lacking for a long time. But it's still very rare that these institutions are ever held accountable for the killing of Black women. So essentially that was, more of an exception to the rule, but there's still, and that's partly because I'm sure of the amount of publicity and national attention that her murder experienced. You often don't get that. There are so many cases of Black women being killed in general, but by police as well, that don't get that level of national attention. And so the fact that her case did, I think, did contribute to an increased likelihood that there was going to be a conviction and some level of accountability. I mean, you had this glaring video that made very clear the circumstances of what happened there, and the nation saw it. So yes, that was a space where but we definitely need more of that. We need more acknowledgement of these types of homicide, and more officers held accountable when those types of detrimental circumstances happen. You
mentioned the video. In that video, which is very disturbing, it seems to see the reaction from the officer when he was interacting with her. She said something playful, "I rebuke you in the name of Jesus." That's a very common term, expression, especially in Black communities and Black Americans. It seems non-threatening. He was not aware of this. This education where you're not aware of basic things in Black culture could get you killed. What was your reaction when you heard that?
It was very disturbing. I mean, first of all, they were just words, right? So the fact that such a significant offense was taken by just those words, I think, speaks to the larger dynamics in this society in terms of the place of Black women and what we're supposed to say or not say to authority figures. And if we do respond in a certain way, especially because of stereotypes of Black women, oftentimes even just simple words like that are taken in a very offensive, they're taken as offensive on the receiving end, and subsequently sometimes that overreaction in this case is an extreme case of overreaction to a set of words, right? And there was a significant disparity there. I mean, she's just an individual who actually called the police to say, I'm concerned that something, I might have a prowler here, right? She was calling for support, so in that, and he was the authority figure in that particular space, and he had a deadly weapon on him, right? And so, despite those sort of positions, he took that level of offense to something that was said to him and reacted with lethal violence. And that's part of the problem in circumstances like this, right? That level of disproportionate response or violence or reaction to things like a simple statement, because oftentimes our words are received as offensive or problematic.
Now, here in New Mexico, we've had a lot of focus on missing and murdered Indigenous women.
Yes.
What's the overlap that you see or you recognize between murdered indigenous women and the murdering of black women?
I do see a lot of overlap there. Excuse me. There has been for centuries now, excuse me, differences in terms of how women of color, and in particular black women and indigenous women, our lives have simply been less valued. We've been stereotyped, we've been sexualized, we've been violated at rates that are in significant disparity to white populations, our white counterparts here in the States. And the reality is that there has been limited attention that has been directed towards caring about and addressing the fact that both of our communities are experiencing significant violations of our women to the point where some of those women are actually lost. So we experience higher rates of intimate partner violence, we experience higher rates of sexual assault, and we experience higher rates of murder. And there's a reason why our particular communities are experiencing those disparate rates. And so when you talk about communities that have had historically struggles in terms of being validated and appreciated by this country, that the murder and missing of our women definitely is a manifestation of the fact that our women aren't cared about as much. And we definitely need to, those historical legacies of displacement, of slavery, of, just the devaluing of our bodies, ourselves, our communities, that unfortunately, in some respects, potentially different manifestations, continues to this very day. And that manifestation, that missing and murdered of both of our communities' women, is a prime example of that.
Historically, violence against black women have often received this limited, sustained media attention and policy attention. How does this invisibility shape our public understanding and the urgency of this response? I keep thinking of R. Kelly. It took us 15 years, almost 2 decades, to finally have some sort of reckoning about his behavior. Why are we not getting this attention with black women? What's stopping us?
Yeah, I think part of it, again, is the sort of devaluing of black people's lives. There's a lot of disparities that we experience. This is just one additional one, but even if you think about things like black maternal and infant mortality, there are significant disparities there as well. And even as our nation has made progress in terms of sort of addressing on a basic level maternal and infant mortality, the disparities have stayed significant for black women and black babies, right? And so this general devaluing of sort of black lives manifests whether we're talking about black men that are disproportionate victims of homicide, or black women in terms of what we're here talking about today, or our babies in terms of infant mortality. And so again, when we're not sort of valuing and appreciating these lives, then their deaths are less consequential. And so we definitely need, and again, because they are, we don't highlight the fact that these disparities exist, and not enough attention is being paid to trying to sort of rectify that. We don't receive the adequate attention, therefore the complexity of the problem is not understood. We still want to sort of deny the impacts that things like historical racism and how that has, to this day, generational trauma, disenfranchised positions, those things have continued to affect our communities generation after generation. And unfortunately, if you don't really, value or care about a particular community, you're not going to highlight situations like these disparities. Subsequently, there are a lot of people who, despite how significant this disparity is, don't know that it exists, right? But quite frankly, there's some that don't care that it exists. And so that's why it's important for us to really highlight and get the word out about it, to just raise awareness, and then ideally be able to couple that with adequate attention and resources that, again, address the sort of underlying structural factors that lead to these disparities.
Recently, a Mississippi-based civil rights group released a report that says there are about a dozen of alleged modern-day lynchings across the southern states. And most of these deaths have been classified as either unsolved or suicides. Without speculating on any of these cases, what kind of questions should researchers and public health officials be asking about these cases if we have something called modern day lynchings, the hanging of someone on a tree and someone allegedly committing suicide that way?
Yeah.
It raises a lot of questions, but what should we be asking about that?
We should be asking what the real question is, and what we should really have a reckoning with our, historical racism and how that still is manifesting in multiple forms today. I mean, unfortunately, yes, there are people who thought things like groups like hate groups, white supremacist groups, etc. There are folks who honestly thought these groups were gone, right? But they were never actually gone. They kind of went underground, and we saw a resurgence of them from the time that President Obama essentially was elected, and we started seeing, those groups, those actions again, sort of come to the surface, unfortunately. And when you don't have, when those types of groups and actors and crimes aren't properly acknowledged as hate crimes, as aren't fully recognized in the way that they should be, then these things are allowed to continue to happen, because now there's a resurgence and proliferation of those hate groups, that hate speech, and it's not being properly condemned. So it's just sort of growing and manifesting, and people are, now being more bold and blatant about these types of killings, essentially. And unfortunately, until we have a true reckoning with our history, in terms of our history of how how Black people came to be in this space, and how they've been treated through centuries, we're going to continue to have those types of episodes that happen, unfortunately.
If we were to look at this data with Black women and the murdering of Black women 5 or 10 years from now, what do you hope you would see? What would progress look like, and how do we achieve that?
Oh my gosh. Well, I guess on a very basic level, I would certainly like to see those disparities decrease, right? The reality is, we have dynamics of sexism in general that increase the vulnerability of women in general, for example, in relationships. So they're more likely to be victims of intimate partner homicide, to be killed by someone they know, et cetera. So I would definitely, in general, like to see the murder of women overall decline. But I certainly want to see those disparities narrow, right? When you're talking about, an average of, 4 times as many Black women being murdered, that should indicate a significant problem structurally. And so when we think about, some of the legislation, Minnesota is essentially the first and the only state that has a missing and murdered African American women task force. Similar legislation has been presented at the national level and resisted, and I doubt that will pass anytime soon. And other states, such as Wisconsin, has put forth similar legislation, but again, that has stalled as well. And those task forces are designed to document and recognize the magnitude of the problem, and put resources into actually addressing, studying why the underlying causes of this, and putting resources into sort of addressing that. So I certainly would like to see that legislation advance on a national level, and I would like to see more states also advance similar legislation, and consequently the resources that come along with being able to address things like that. So when we're specifically talking about murder rates, right, in terms of Black women, those are some of the things that would contribute to that. So certainly 5-10 years from now, again, I would like to see the national legislation pass that has been put forth, and I would like to see those task force and those resources being enacted in states, and true efforts to get at some of the things like the disproportionate poverty that African American communities experience, a lot of the disenfranchised conditions in the neighborhoods that facilitate over-policing, things like this. And so certainly our police forces need better training and accountability in terms of being able to be more culturally aware, to even better understanding things like how to engage with people with mental illness or in distress, or recognizing hidden biases, unconscious biases that may make you more likely to receive the words of a Black woman in a certain way and potentially react with lethal violence, as was in the Massey case. And so, having those different types of trainings and awareness for agencies like police, but also then having those national and state policies that put resources into recognizing this problem and properly addressing it, again, in a more structural way. There's a reason why these significant disparities exist, and it lies on a structural level. And until we acknowledge that and put the proper resources into that, we're not going to get to the end of it. So 5 to 10 years from now, at the very least, those are some of the things that I would like to see.
Dr. Tamika Gillum, thank you for joining us here on New Mexico in Focus.
Thank you again for having me. I appreciate it.